Some women don't slam doors. They simply stop speaking, and in that stillness, something ancient begins to move. A man rarely fears words. He fears the absence of them. Because when a woman once so alive, so responsive, so full of light, withdraws into a quiet he cannot penetrate, he feels the shadow of himself for the very first time. Silence, to the unawakened masculine, is not peace. It is a mirror, and what he sees inside that mirror is the reflection of what he once refused to see in her eyes. She used to explain herself. She used to fight to be understood, to prove that her softness wasn't weakness, that her emotions weren't chaos, that her tears weren't manipulation but truth. But then came the breaking point, not an explosion, not a storm, but an implosion. The kind only a woman who has seen herself through his blindness can know. He doesn't realize it yet, but her silence isn't punishment. It's prophecy. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And that's what her silence does. It pulls him into confrontation with his fate. He feels it first as irritation, then confusion, then an ache he cannot name. Because her silence speaks the language of the soul, a language the ego cannot argue with. He begins to wonder why the world feels quieter, heavier, why her absence sounds louder than her presence ever did, why he sees her everywhere, in the corner of a cafe, in the echo of a song, in the eyes of other women who smile nothing like her. It's because silence is not emptiness. It's energy redirected inward, and the feminine, when she withdraws her energy, becomes mythic. He begins to feel what Jung called the withdrawal of the anima, the loss of the inner feminine image that once animated his emotional life. The man who once dismissed her depths now faces the hollow echo of his own. The laughter of other women cannot fill the silence she left. Because she didn't leave noise, she left meaning. And that meaning haunts him. It vibrates in the space between the text messages he never sent, in the nights he scrolls through old photos, and tells himself he's over her, while something inside him whispers, "Then why does it still feel like she's here?" Silence has a strange way of bending time. To her, it feels like peace. To him, it feels like absence stretching into eternity. He begins to remember things he once dismissed. The sound of her laughter, the way her eyes softened when he spoke carelessly, the moments he thought didn't matter. But memory, once stirred by guilt, becomes its own haunting. This is the first sign that her silence has entered him, not as punishment, but as reflection. He begins to see himself through the lens she once offered him, and what he sees unsettles him. Jung called it the meeting with the shadow, the moment a man confronts the parts of himself he has exiled. When she was near, she absorbed his projections, his fear of failure, his longing to be understood, his own forgotten tenderness. She carried the weight of both their inner worlds, thinking it was love. But the moment she withdrew, he was left alone with what he had once placed in her hands. The mirror shattered, and now every fragment reflects a truth he avoided. He begins to feel the tension of unspoken words, not hers, but his own. Every silence between them now hums with unfinished confession. He replays conversations, moments where she went quiet, moments he laughed instead of listening. And slowly he realizes, her silence didn't begin when she stopped talking. It began when he stopped hearing. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of projection and withdrawal. When what we see in another is simply our own unlived life, our repressed emotion, our denied vulnerability. She was never too emotional. She was merely expressing what he had buried within himself. And when she finally fell silent, it wasn't indifference. It was a return to integrity. She stopped holding the mirror for him. Now he's forced to face what she once contained. And that confrontation, that hollow echo of his own inner absence, is unbearable. He doesn't know it yet, but the silence he feels from her is not merely her withdrawal. It's his disconnection from his own soul. When the feminine energy leaves a man's life, it's not just a woman walking away. It's the departure of life's reflection, of emotional color, of intuitive light. It's as though the world turns grayscale. He notices it in subtle ways. The food tastes duller, the music emptier, the nights longer, and he tells himself he misses her. But what he truly misses is the part of himself that could feel deeply. This is the haunting nature of silence. It doesn't chase. It simply reflects. It turns absence into a teacher. And in that quiet, a man either numbs himself deeper into distraction or begins to awaken. Because no woman's silence lingers this long, unless it's meant to awaken something ancient within him, the forgotten longing to feel, to understand, to connect beyond words. There is a moment, always quiet, always late, when his defenses begin to crumble, when distraction no longer works, and the laughter of strangers feels hollow. He begins to sense her in strange places, in the reflection of rain on glass, in the way the night folds around him when he can't sleep, in the pause between songs that used to make her smile. This is not imagination. This is energy remembering its source. When she withdrew her warmth, she reclaimed the life force that once animated his world. And though he cannot name it, he feels the vacuum she left, the invisible gravity of a woman who has become her own sun. Jung said that every loss carries within it the seed of transformation. But for the unready masculine, that seed feels like decay. He calls it loneliness, but it is not loneliness. It is the first whisper of awakening. He doesn't understand that her silence is not rejection. It is initiation. The kind of initiation that strips a man of illusion and leaves him face to face with his own hollowness. At first, he resists. He blames her coldness, her distance, her mystery. He tells himself she has changed. But what he doesn't see is that she has returned. Returned to the place within herself where love is no longer performance, but presence. And that presence, even from afar, is what keeps haunting him. Because a woman who has gone inward carries a frequency the world can't mute. Her silence becomes sacred. Her absence becomes architecture, a shape his soul keeps tracing in the dark. He reaches out, sometimes indirectly, a message that says nothing, a story posted just to be seen, a casual reminder that he still exists. But she doesn't respond. Not from cruelty, but from clarity. She has learned that words cannot resurrect what was never understood. That explanation cannot heal blindness. That sometimes, the kindest thing love can do is dissolve. Her stillness is not waiting. It is becoming. And in that becoming, she embodies something Jung called individuation, the process by which the soul becomes whole. No longer defined by the reflections of others, she now lives from the quiet pulse of her own inner truth. He feels the shift. Even without words, he senses it, because the energy between them has reversed. What once flowed outward now flows back to her. And in that reversal, he begins to feel her silence not as absence, but as a mirror held to his own unrest. He begins to understand, too late, that what haunts him is not her silence. It is his failure to listen when she was still speaking. That is the second sign of her haunting. When silence becomes self-reflection. When every unspoken word turns into an echo of accountability. And yet, beneath the ache, there is also a part of him respects the power she holds now. A power not built on dominance, but on detachment. She has become untouchable in the most human way. The same woman he once took for granted now lives rent-free in the corridors of his mind, not because she demanded to be remembered, but because she no longer needed to be. He doesn't hear your voice anymore, yet he hears it everywhere. In the hum of the refrigerator, in the faint click of his lighter, in the low whisper of his own thoughts at night. That's what silence does when it's not born from indifference but from depth. It echoes louder than words ever could. When a woman like her goes quiet, it's not passive. It's sacred. It's an unspoken ceremony between what she used to tolerate and what she's now transcending. He once thought silence meant defeat, that if she wasn't pleading, explaining, or defending, she must have run out of emotion. But he was wrong. Her silence isn't the absence of feeling. It's the reorganization of her soul. He begins to notice the absence like a mirror, because now, with no voice to battle or soothe him, he's left alone with his own. The projections he once cast upon her, of need, control, blame, now fall back onto him. He sees, perhaps for the first time, that she wasn't the chaos. She was the reflection of his own unhealed disorder. This is the first haunting of silence. It forces a man into his own mind. Jung called this the confrontation with the shadow, that inner realm where every suppressed emotion, every unowned impulse, and every denied truth waits patiently. When she stops speaking, he loses his favorite mirror. He can no longer escape himself by reacting to her. And suddenly, he realizes that what he thought he despised about her, the unpredictability, the depth, the intensity, were simply fragments of himself he was afraid to meet. So he walks around haunted, not by her presence, but by what she revealed. Every quiet hour is now a classroom. Every still night, a confession booth. Her silence becomes the therapist he never visited, the confessional he never entered, the truth he never wanted to hear. Because now, when he reaches for his phone and there's no message waiting, when he revisits old conversations and reads them like scriptures from a lost religion, he begins to understand. She never left to punish him. She left to preserve herself. And yet, her silence punishes him more than any sharp word could have. Because words give direction. Silence leaves him lost. It's not cruelty. It's consequence. It's the natural echo that forms when a man mistakes emotional labor for love, when he confuses constant access for connection. In her silence, he's not just missing her. He's missing the version of himself that only existed through her compassion. She held his softness when he could not. She saw his potential when he was blind to it. And now, without her energy to stabilize his emotional storms, he must learn to face his own winds. That's the paradox of her quiet departure. It feels like rejection, but it's actually initiation. It's the soul's way of saying, grow now or stay haunted forever. And he begins to feel it, that unfamiliar ache. Not the kind born from losing someone, but the kind that comes from losing the illusion of control. This is where the anima, the inner feminine, begins to stir within him. He sees her everywhere, not in body, but in symbol. In music that suddenly makes him weep. In dreams where she turns to him, expression unreadable. In strangers who remind him of her essence, the poise, the gentleness, the quiet power. Her silence didn't vanish, it transformed. It became a haunting frequency, vibrating through the unseen spaces between moments. And as Jung said, what we do not make conscious, returns as fate. Now, she's not his ex. She's his unfinished reflection. The ghost of his unintegrated soul. And while she walks lighter, her energy no longer tethered to his emotional survival, he begins his descent. Not into despair, but into self-awareness. That's what her silence awakens. Not guilt, but recognition. The dawning realization that she was not his to possess. She was his to learn from. And in the quiet echo of her absence, he finally meets the one she always saw. The man beneath the projection. There comes a moment, quiet, invisible, unannounced, when the same silence that once felt like a wound becomes a crown. She doesn't notice it at first. There's no ceremony, no flash of lightning. Just an ordinary day, sunlight falling through her window like forgiveness. And suddenly she feels it, the weight that used to crush her chest is gone. This is the sacred shift, the alchemy of detachment. Her silence, once born from pain, has now become her language of power. No longer the silence of suppression, but of sovereignty. The woman who once tried to explain herself, who twisted her voice into shapes small enough to be accepted. She no longer needs to, because the absence that once screamed with ache now hums with peace. You see, silence is not emptiness. It's containment. It's what happens when a feminine soul reclaims her energy from everything that drained her. Jung wrote that what you resist not only persists, but grows in size. For so long, she resisted letting go, hoping he'd see, hoping he'd wake, hoping love could be repaired by effort alone. But awakening doesn't come from clinging. It comes from release. From allowing what must die, to die. And in that death, a rebirth. Her detachment does not mean she feels less. It means she no longer feels for him. She feels through herself. Every emotion, once filtered through his validation, now becomes pure, unedited, divine. He still thinks silence means distance. He doesn't understand that silence can also mean transformation. Because while he's haunted by the echo, she's being guided by it. She's no longer orbiting his gravity, she's discovered her own. Her quiet has become her ritual. Morning coffee tastes different. No longer a pause between anxiety and waiting, but a communion with self. Music sounds different, no longer reminders of him, but reflections of her inner world expanding. She dances again, not for anyone's gaze, but because her body finally remembers what freedom feels like. The feminine that detaches doesn't become hard, she becomes whole. She doesn't lose her empathy, she simply stops giving it where it's wasted. She no longer seeks safety in someone else's understanding. She becomes the sanctuary. This is individuation. The Jungian process of becoming undivided, of integrating every shadow, every ache, every lost piece, until she no longer needs another to mirror her back to herself. He may still search for her in other faces, in fleeting affection, in temporary admiration, in women who talk too loud to drown the silence she left behind. But it won't work, because you cannot replace someone who met your soul when you were asleep. His lesson is reflection. Hers is resurrection. She no longer explains her worth, she embodies it. She doesn't need revenge or validation, her peace is both. Her silence, once a battlefield, is now a temple. And slowly he begins to realize, the quiet he feared most was never about her absence. It was about his awakening. Because when she detached, she didn't vanish. She became untouchable. The feminine silence that once whispered, "I'm hurting," now hums, "I'm free." And in that shift, the entire dynamic collapses. No longer the chaser and the chased. No longer the wounded and the wounding. Only two souls, finally facing the truth. Love cannot survive where awareness is absent. So she stops waiting for him to return. Because she has already arrived. Fully, fiercely in her own becoming. The silence that once echoed with longing now rings with purpose. And in its resonance, she hears the truest liberation of all. That to be unseen by another is not tragedy. It is invitation to finally see yourself. There is a sound that rises from silence. A music that cannot be written, only felt. It begins softly, almost imperceptible. A pulse beneath her ribs. A rhythm older than language. It is the sound of a woman remembering herself. She does not chase love anymore. She creates it. Not from desire, not from lack, but from alignment. Every step she takes is deliberate, like poetry in motion. A woman reborn through her own stillness. The man who once drained her now becomes a faint memory. Not a villain, not a savior. Just a shadow that taught her how to see the light. Because she has learned the most sacred truth of the feminine journey. That love was never about finding someone to complete her. It was about returning to the parts she abandoned in the name of being chosen. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And so she turned inward, peeling back the layers of projection, dismantling the illusions she once called love. She saw how she had mistaken chaos for passion, how she had confused intensity for intimacy. She began to see that what she was seeking in him was never him, it was her own reflection in disguise. And that realization shattered everything beautifully. She began to walk through the world differently. Her pace slowed, her gaze softened, her silence deepened, not the silence of avoidance, but of embodiment. She no longer needs to prove, to perform, to please. She knows that the energy she gives is sacred, that her presence alone alters the air around her. Now, when she speaks, the world listens, because her words come from stillness, not survival. And when she is silent, the world still feels her, because her absence carries weight. The man who once dismissed her quiet, now feels it like gravity. He remembers her laughter in the sound of rain, her eyes in the reflection of late-night screens, her energy in the emptiness that no one else can fill. He doesn't realize it yet, But her silence became his mirror. It showed him everything he refused to face. His avoidance, his disconnection, his fear of depth disguised as control. And so, while she rose into awakening, he began to descend into awareness. That is the paradox of love and loss. One rises through surrender, the other falls through resistance. Both, in their own way, are being called home. But she no longer waits, because her heart, once a battlefield, has become a temple of discernment. She now guards her peace the way she once guarded his emotions. She offers her softness only to those who meet her in stillness, to those who understand that silence is not absence, but presence in its purest form. She knows that the feminine energy, when detached, is not cold, it's clear. It doesn't chase validation, it magnetizes respect. It doesn't beg to be understood, it becomes a mystery worth understanding. And in that sacred clarity, she is finally free. She has entered the final stage of individuation, the union of the inner feminine and masculine, an alchemical balance where she no longer seeks wholeness through another, because she is the wholeness. She no longer romanticizes the man who couldn't see her. She blesses him for being the mirror that shattered her illusion, because without that pain, she might never have remembered her power. And as she walks away, not in bitterness, but in quiet sovereignty, the air shifts. The story ends, not with vengeance, but with vision. The same woman who once gave everything, now gives only what resonates. The same heart that once ached for understanding, now beats to the rhythm of inner peace. And when he finally reaches out, searching for the warmth he once took for granted, she does not answer in anger. She answers in silence. The same silence that once broke her, now her most eloquent reply. Because she understands the eternal truth. Not every connection is meant to last. Some exist to awaken, to mirror our shadows back to us, to strip away the illusions we built around love. And in that awakening, something far greater than romance is born. Consciousness. The woman who was once afraid of losing love has now become love itself. The kind that doesn't beg, doesn't chase, doesn't crumble, just is. And as she stands beneath the evening sky, the wind brushing through her hair like memory, she whispers not to him, but to herself. The woman who walks away in silence isn't weak. She simply sees more. And with that, she disappears into her own becoming. Neither wounded nor waiting, but wide awake, radiant, and finally whole. Her silence, once haunted, now sings, not as an echo of what was lost, but as a hymn of what was found.